Being fluent in Chinese is more about being good at applying what you know rather than knowing everything. Many students focus too much on learning new things and neglect mastering what they've already learned. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about becoming fluent in Chinese. The F word is a sensitive one in language learning context and can mean almost anything depending on who's using it. Today we're going to discuss how to become fluent in Chinese listening, speaking, reading and writing, where fluent simply means being able to use Chinese smoothly and effectively to achieve communicative goals, regardless if this is expressing yourself or understanding others. In this context, fluent is not used as a synonym for advanced, but rather as a way to distinguish mastery from merely knowing about something. This means that this episode is relevant for learners on all levels, including beginners, who can certainly be fluent in Chinese, albeit in a limited area. Being able to express yourself smoothly and effectively is more about being good at applying what you know rather than knowing everything. Quantity plays a role, but quality is more important. As I demonstrated in an earlier podcast episode 96, it's possible to express oneself fluently in speaking or writing using only 1,000 words or so, even about topics such as second language acquisition. This, however, requires you to be very good at using the words you know. This is what this episode is about. When it comes to understanding what other people say, it's not enough to just know a word, you need to know it so well that you can recall its meaning instantly and be able to recognize it in different contexts. When reading, fluency demands a high level of automated processing of characters, since stopping every 5 words or so to try to remember what something means doesn't meet anybody's definition of fluent. This is also what we're going to talk about in this week's episode. Fluency development is one of Paul Nation's 4 strands, a framework I refer to occasionally here on the Hacking Chinese podcast, and that I introduced properly also in a recent episode, that was episode 94, and I will also put links in the description. In his 2007 article, Nation defines fluency development as activities where 1. All of what the learners are listening to, reading, speaking, or writing is largely familiar to them. That is, there are no unfamiliar language or largely unfamiliar content or discourse features. 2. The learner's focus is on receiving or conveying meaning. 3. There is some pressure or encouragement to perform at a faster pace than usual. 4. There is a large amount of input or output. So number 1, which is about familiar content and language, is not too hard to understand, because if you want to get better at using what we already know, we need to focus on familiar language and content. If there are too many unknown words, for example, focus will automatically shift to dealing with the unfamiliar language, which is exactly what we don't want. I will probably publish a separate article and podcast episode discussing number 2, which is about receiving and conveying meaning, and why you want more meaning-focused practice, but for now it's enough to say that the main focus should be on using Chinese to actually communicate with another person, or trying to understand what they are saying or writing. If you're not receiving or conveying meaning, the activity isn't meaning-focused, which disqualifies maybe 90% of all textbooks exercises I've seen, and a good chunk of activities that take place in language classrooms too, especially at universities. Number 3, which is about pressure or encouragement to perform faster, is unique for fluency development because, like I said above, fluency is to a large extent about not just knowing something, but knowing it fast. This is crucial for all 4 skills, although it is less pressing when reading and writing, because we can often have more control over how much time we spend and where we spend it. When listening or speaking, however, taking too long to recall something can be as bad as not knowing it at all. I've discussed this in 2 articles, whereof one has made it to the podcast so far. The first one is Chinese listening strategies, improving listening speed, and this is about, well, how quickly you're able to process spoken language, and I'll put a link in the description to that. The second article is How Important is Reading Speed on tests like the HSK and TOCFL, and that was covered in episode 43 of the podcast. Speed is central to fluency development, but it can manifest itself somewhat differently. First, we can try to do something faster. Second, we can choose content where speed follows naturally, such as revisiting familiar content or focusing on language well within our comfort zone. Nation has researched the role of timed exercises and focus on speed and concluded that they not only increase fluency, but also have positive effects on accuracy, and I've put a few references if you're interested at the bottom of the article on Hacking Chinese. In Nation's framework, each strand is supposed to take up 1/4 of the study time, but in reality, fluency development usually takes up much less than that. Exactly how much depends on where you're learning Chinese, including if you're enrolled in a course or if you're studying on your own. If you're enrolled in a course or studying independently, my goal today is to persuade you to invest more time in fluency development and also show you how you can do that. If you're a teacher, I want to convince you that you should make fluency development a part of your course, although not necessarily fully in class, especially not if you teach adults who can be relied on to spend time learning outside your lessons. Fluency development is one of the most neglected areas of institutional language learning, especially in formal situations that value quantitative goals. I've studied Chinese at many different language schools and several universities, and most of them have strict rules about how quickly students should progress in textbooks. It's as if the curriculum designers think that having gone through a chapter guarantees that the students have mastered the content, so the class that finishes the most chapters by the end of the semester has the best teacher and the best students. Sometimes it feels like educators don't think that one is studying seriously unless the students learn a ton of new words and grammar patterns. This is painfully clear when engaging with some private tutors who seem to think that their quality is best judged by how much new vocabulary they cram into each lesson. Naturally, students who learn Chinese full-time in an immersion environment will get plenty of practice outside the classroom and outside of lessons, and Nation's 4 strands are meant to cover all learning, not just what goes on in class. Still, I think it's safe to say that most students vastly overestimate the importance of superficial, easily quantifiable signs of progress, such as finishing a textbook or a chapter in a textbook, learning 1,000 characters, or passing a certain HSK level. And therefore, students underestimate the importance of consolidating what they already know. Or, in other words, they neglect fluency development. This is even more true if you're learning Chinese in your home country, in which case fluency development might be lacking entirely, since most students will never do it spontaneously outside class. I wrote more about this problem in an earlier article called "Language is Communication, Not Just an Abstract Subject to Study", link in the description. Okay, so now that we know what fluency development is and why it's important, let's look at activities and exercises you can use. You can of course come up with your own using the criteria I listed earlier, but I think some inspiration to get started is in place. These are not the only options and probably aren't the best either, they're just the ones that I use when learning and teaching Chinese, and if you have your own suggestions or want to contribute, please leave a comment on Hacking Chinese and I will consider adding it to the article. Let's start with developing fluency in listening. As I discussed in the article I mentioned about listening speed earlier, fluency is absolutely crucial for listening. Unless you're listening to a recording you can easily stop, rewind, or slow down, you usually don't have time to search for the meaning of a word. It has to just pop up when needed, preferably without you having to pay attention to it at all. Here are a few activities to help you develop fluency in Chinese listening. Number 1. Listen to spoken Chinese below your current level. Remember, for something to count as fluency development, it needs to contain almost no new words or grammar. By being exposed to language you know over and over in different contexts, the time you need to make sense of it will decrease. Because the level is relatively easy, you can listen a lot. Number 2. Listen to the same recording again or re-listen to old audio. Unless you're listening to something really easy, you won't understand everything the first time. Every additional time you listen will bring further understanding, and at some point this starts counting as fluency development. The exception is if the recording contains too much Chinese you simply don't know, in which case you're learning new things, not getting better at what you already know. Number 3. Adjust the speed of the Chinese you listen to. This is a complex topic I plan to revisit in a separate article and podcast episode later, but there are at least 3 different ways in which the speed of the Chinese you listen to can vary. First, the speaker can talk slower, which usually also means that pronunciation changes, because people who speak slowly tend to enunciate and pronunciation is altered by rate of speech in general. For example, a higher rate of speech results in more tone changes, more assimilation, more reduction of unstressed syllables, and so on. The second way of lowering the speed is to insert pauses strategically between sentences, giving you as a listener time to process what was said without altering the rate of speech itself. Third, you can use computer software to slow the audio down, which will then retain all the characteristics of fast speech while allowing you more time to process it. For fluency development, though, you want to move away from slowly enunciated Chinese, the hallmark of textbook audio and Chinese learning materials in general. If you want suggestions for what to listen to, I have plenty of suggestions in the written article on Hacking Chinese. So let's move on to fluency in Chinese reading. While you can often take your time when reading, fluency development is about covering more text in less time. For this to work, it has to be easy. Here are some suggestions for improving fluency in Chinese reading. Number 1. Read Chinese below your current level. I already talked about this for listening, and the logic here is the same, so I'll keep this brief. Graded readers, such as Mandarin Companion, are the best, but you can also rely on several different textbooks for a similar effect, especially on lower levels. This was also covered recently on the podcast, and we talked about using more than one textbook in episode 95. Number 2. Rereading, especially with a specific purpose in mind. Skimming or scanning a text for specific things works well. Playing text adventure games on WordSwing is also great because you will revisit the same scenes many times and read the same options over and over. But since you need to be on the alert for new options or changes in the scene, you still need to pay attention. We deliberately scramble the order of the choices in these games to make sure you practice this type of reading. Number 3. Simply try to read faster. While speed reading sounds very ambitious for second language learners who struggle with basic literacy, it can still be a worthwhile effort to challenge yourself to read an easy passage quickly. You can always reread it for further practice and full understanding. For speed reading in particular, check the article Chinese Reading Speed Revisited, link in the description. Number 4. Read many texts about the same topic. This is called narrow reading, and the idea is to extend your comfort zone by reading many texts about one topic instead of having a completely new topic for each text. For example, you might read 10 different accounts of a news event or 5 different plot summaries of the same book. The first few times probably won't count as fluency development because there will be too much new language, but the more you keep reading about the same topic, the closer to fluency development you get. If you want suggestions for what to read, there are plenty of suggestions in the written article on Hacking Chinese. Next, let's move on to how to develop fluency in Chinese speaking, and this is what I think most people think about when they see the word fluent. They associate it with being able to produce Chinese orally in an effective and smooth manner. So here are some exercises you can try. Number 1. Talk about the same topic more than once. People who live in a Chinese-speaking environment sound significantly more fluent when talking about why they're learning Chinese compared to almost any other topic, for the simple reason that they've done this over and over. By talking about the same thing with several different people, you gradually become more fluent. You can do this systematically too, such as in a classroom, by mixing up who talks with whom, but keeping the topic the same. Number 2. Talk about the same topic with less and less time available. An example of this is 4-3-2 exercises, referring to the idea of having to talk about something first in 4 minutes, then 3, and then 2. This type of activity works well both with conversations. For example, you can ask each other and answer the same questions within a given amount of time. Or presentations, introduce yourself, your country, your research project, or whatever suits your level. And the point is that you do this in gradually shorter periods of time. Of course, the numbers 4, 3, 2 are arbitrarily chosen here, and you can go with any time limits you fancy. Number 3. Play word games where you describe words without being able to say them. This strengthens your ability to use the Chinese you know, and if you think about it, not being allowed to say a word is similar to not knowing the word, so playing this kind of game is great for navigating your way around holes in your vocabulary. In my opinion, this is both one of the most fun and one of the best ways of practicing fluency. I've written an entire article about this, and we also spent episode 73 talking about word games to build fluency. Finally, let's say a few words about developing fluency in Chinese writing. As we saw with reading versus listening, writing is normally not as time-dependent as speaking is. Being able to write Chinese fluently is useful, but for most people not nearly as useful as being fluent in speaking and listening. Outside proficiency tests, it's rarely a requirement to have to write quickly. This, however, doesn't mean that fluency development is not interesting, it just means that the need is less pressing. For some of you, though, writing might actually be very important too, so I don't want to neglect writing completely. On the whole, fluency development for writing works much the same as for speaking, meaning that writing about the same topic while varying the time frame, audience, and purpose works well. This is especially true if you suffer any kind of writer's block and find it incredibly hard to write anything at all. Choose a topic you know reasonably well, set a time for 10 minutes and focus only on conveying meaning about that topic until the alarm goes off. You don't need to show this to anyone, so don't worry about accuracy. You can then repeat this or revisit the topic again later. You can and probably should use this technique when starting a more serious writing project too. That means that we are approaching the end of this episode, and while the exercises that I listed are of course not exhaustive, I hope that I have given enough examples and explained the principles behind them so that you can make smart decisions about your own fluency development. Remember, fluency is mostly about being really good at what you already know, and this typically doesn't come automatically if you're always focusing on learning new things. Make sure you don't always feel like you're drowning in new words, and make sure you spend some time with those that you already know. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.